We're okay, yeah, this has been a big issue. Good afternoon, everyone. I am calling to order our regularly scheduled meeting of the Intergovernmental Relations Committee. My name is Elizabeth Glidden, and I am the chair of the committee, and I am joined today by Council President Johnson, Councilmember Cano, and Councilmember Quincy, and together we are a quorum of the committee and able to do the business of the committee. We have 5 items on our agenda for today, and the first is actually a presentation of a legislative advocacy award to the city from the Immigration Law Center. And I'm going to go down in front of the podium along with Councilmember Cano. We're going to invite some folks forward, including community members and city staff, and we'll discuss the award. Well, thank you everyone for joining us here, and we have a great collection of community members as well as city staff members, and then John Keller from the Immigration Law Center. And you see such a variety of people here because we are really part of a large coalition together that worked on an important issue to the community, and I'm actually going to turn the mic to Mr. Keller to introduce the award from his organization and talk a little bit about that.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here to present this award. My name is John Keller. I'm the Executive Director of the Immigrant Law Center of Minnesota. We're the state's largest provider of legal services and advocacy to immigrants and refugees in the state. This award really is a presentation that was given at our annual gala just about 10 days ago. Thank you all who were able to be there. We had over 600 guests at the new depot in St. Paul, so it was still nice, even though it was St. Paul. Hope we can do it in Minneapolis one of these years. And it was a recognition, as you said, of tremendous effort, an effort by a broad array of interest groups, of peoples from different backgrounds. And I actually have the list right under here that I want to make sure that we include. So it really brought together elected officials, as well as folks in higher education, business, advocacy, grassroots, and students to bring about the historic change that is the Minnesota Prosperity Act, or the DREAM Act. Your co-awardees included Governor Dayton, Senator Sandy Pappas, Representative Carlos Mariani, the City of Minneapolis, obviously, University of Minnesota, all of higher ed, so Minnesota State Colleges and Universities, MnSCU, Minnesota Private College Council, the Minnesota Office of Higher Ed, the Minnesota Chamber of Commerce, Navigate, Centro Campesino, the Citizens League, Mesa Latina, several members who are here from Mesa today, and Education Minnesota. And most importantly, I would say, to our success was the commitment and the turnout and the dedication of really the youth of today and the young adults that are already performing at a very high level. What the city was able to do and accomplish with this partnership and coalition is to make the dreams come true of young people, residents of Minneapolis, residents from all over the state, that for the very first time after this legislation passed, kids who grew up here, who came, our youngest client that we helped with deferred action arrived at age 5 months, and who graduated from high school in the state of Minnesota, can finally pay equal in-state tuition to further their dreams, to really realize their dreams. On top of it, with the legislation that passed, Minnesota became only the 4th state out of 50 in the United States that also gives equal access to financial aid, so that we knew that for low-income folks, in-state tuition, just like for many hardworking citizens, isn't enough, and we wanted to create equal access to financial resources. So financial aid also became available through this legislation. I really salute the city for your leadership, Mariano and Jean, for the hard work day in and day out at the Capitol, a hard place to stay day in and day out. So thank you for all of your hard work and leadership, the countless hours and meetings, and really helping this legislation become a reality finally. So the City of Minneapolis, thank you so much.
Thank you. And I didn't know if we wanted a few comments. I was going to, maybe Mariana would like to accept the award on behalf of the city. I think as a whole, we are just so proud at the city that we were able to participate in really what was a momentous effort. And I know he doesn't want to say much, but I'm still going to hand the microphone to Mariana Espinoza from our Neighborhood and Community Relations Department.
Well, we're very proud to be working with all the residents, and we're very proud as city to represent everybody. And it's been amazing to work in the community, to work and to build this amazing coalition. So we're proud to live in a city like Minneapolis and to work with everybody. Thank you for your leadership.
Did you want to introduce who else came with you today?
Mariano, so we have Jovita. I don't know if you want to introduce yourselves, or if Mariano, you want to introduce everybody.
Jovita is part of the Latino Engagement Task Force in Mesa Latina, and she's one of the main organizers for the driver license campaign.
Yeah, well, my name is Jovita, and Mariano mentioned. So I'm going to pass this to Gina.
Georgina, and I'm a member of Mesa Latina, and thank you all for the support.
Thank you, and I will allow Councilmember Cano to make some closing remarks.
Well, thank you so much. It's an honor to be standing here today as part of our municipal government, working with our state's strong nonprofit communities, immigrant rights advocates. I'm really proud of the work that our two departments have done in this front, Neighborhood and Community Relations with David Rubador and Jean Ranieri with Intergovernmental Relations. So that's a real aligned effort to help elevate the voices of the Latino community in our city. And I'm very proud to be a part of the City of Minneapolis today for the work that you all have accomplished and have helped us take a leadership in. So thank you everyone for being a part of this, and let's keep the work going.
Thank you. Thank you. And I'm just want to double check with the clerk. Should I receive and file that presentation? So I'll go ahead and move to receive and file. All in approval, please say aye. Aye. Opposed. Next, we have a public hearing on the proposed charter amendment filing fee for municipal elections. And so I believe our city clerk, Mr. Carl, is going to give us an overview of the issue, and then we will open the public hearing.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair. May it please the committee, I'm here to present the proposed amendment to the city charter, which was submitted by the Charter Commission. It pertains to municipal filing fees. Also, I should point out that the Charter Commission Chair, Mr. Barry Clegg, is in the audience and with us today. Filing fees, as you know, are set by state law. For cities of the first class, like Minneapolis, that's addressed under Minnesota statutes, section 205.13. The statutory fee was originally set at $10 and was later increased to $20 in 1967. Charter cities are authorized to set their own filing fee through the regular charter amendment process. The current fee of $20 has not been adjusted since 1967, either by the state of Minnesota or by the city of Minneapolis. State law also provides that a candidate for office may submit a petition in lieu of a filing fee, which is described under Minnesota Statutes 204B.11. The petition in lieu of a candidate filing fee must have the valid signatures of the required number of eligible voters for the particular district, 500 signatures, or 5% of the total number of voters who cast a vote in the election district at the preceding general election. As members are aware, this subject has been discussed on many occasions in the past year. In fact, 2 separate proposals have already been submitted in 2013, both of which failed to secure the unanimous support of the council. The first proposal, which was submitted in March, would have modified the fees for municipal offices as follows. For mayor, $250. For council member, $100. For Board of Estimate and Taxation member, $20. And for Park and Recreation Commissioner, $50. The proposal that was submitted in November last year in the aftermath of the election would have increased fees for municipal offices a bit more. For mayor, the proposed was $500. For council member, $250. For Board of Estimate and Taxation members, $100. And for Park and Recreation Commissioner, $100. In January, in response to a directive from the City Council, I did submit a letter to the Charter Commission outlining the city's support for the reintroduction of a proposal to increase municipal filing fees. As part of its consideration of that proposal, the Charter Commission has submitted an amendment matching its original proposal from March 2013, which, if approved, would set filing fees at the following levels. For mayor, $250. For council member, $100. For Board of Estimate and Taxation member, $20, no change from the current amount. And for Park and Recreation Commissioner, $50. The Charter Commission did conduct a public hearing on this proposal as part of its regular meeting on April 2nd. The proposal was formally submitted on May 5th. Under the statute, the council must conduct a public hearing on the proposed amendment at least 2 weeks, but not more than 1 month after notice is published in the official newspaper. The clerk's office published that notice on May 13th, so we are within the 1 month time frame to act. The city clerk, or the city council, must act within 1 month of that public hearing, or the statutory clock expires on the proposal. That deadline to act is June 27th. To approve this proposal by ordinance requires a unanimous vote of the entire City Council. That is, it requires a 13-0 vote, and it must be approved by the mayor. If the ordinance is approved, it must be published in the city's newspaper, which then begins a 60-day protest period. During that protest period, a petition could be submitted to nullify the ordinance with the valid signatures of registered voters equal to 5% of the turnout from the 2012 presidential, or the valid signatures of 2,000 registered voters, whichever is less. With an 81% turnout in the 2012 election, a 5% requirement would equal 10,791 signatures. Thus, a valid petition would require signatures by 2,000 registered Minneapolis voters. If the council and mayor fail to adopt the proposed amendment by ordinance, the Charter Commission intends to submit the question to the electorate as a ballot question as part of the general election scheduled Tuesday, November 4th. There is a separate timeline associated with submitting ballot questions, which I detailed in my memo, which is dated June 3rd. In short, the Charter Commission would need to formulate and submit ballot language to the City Council by no later than July 8th. The Charter Commission is submitting the proposed amendment to the City Council, hoping that it will proceed under the ordinance provision to make the change to filing fees for municipal offices, which would become effective then in January 2015, along with the new plain language revised version of our city charter. A copy of the proposal was included in your briefing materials, along with a copy of my memo outlining the timelines. I'm happy to stand for questions if the committee has any.
All right, thank you, Mr. Carl. I'm not seeing any questions. So the next step is to open the public hearing. I know Mr. Clegg is here. I don't know if you don't have to say anything. He is shaking his head no. He's not going to add anything to the report by Mr. Carl. Okay, so appreciated. So asking again if anybody wants to testify, and only seeing city staff in the room. So I will go ahead and close the public hearing. I will say thank you again to the Charter Commission for, as we say, sticking with it. this has been part of a little bit of a back and forth on what would be the proper format, because proposing this charter amendment intersected with the time frame of implementing the plain language charter amendment to the Minneapolis City Charter, which is a momentous change to the charter, and then affected sort of the formatting of how this particular change would come forward. So thank you to the Charter Commission. And this has also been discussed, I will say again, multiple times by the City Council. I'm going to move approval of the proposed charter amendment with the language that is before us, and see if there is any discussion. Seeing none, all in approval, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? And that item is approved, and it will move on to the full City Council for this cycle's meeting. Thank you. Next, we have an ethics officer report from the City Attorney's Office. And Ms. Siegel, I'm not seeing Susan Trammell here, so I'm just going to turn to you. I will say that we do have the written report, and I don't know if there's any additional information we should receive.
Madam Chair, I don't believe so. I think the report is fairly thorough, and we're lucky to have Susan Trammell as our ethics officer. She has done an excellent job on it. Mr. Ranieri, anything else to add on that?
Chair, members, Gene Ranieri from the IGR department. I agree with Ms. Siegel. We did a little extra review because of one of our contractors, Lockridge Grindo, also does work for some of the other folks involved in the Southwest Light Rail, and determined there was no conflict.
Okay. Thank you very much. And I'll just note this is really important work that regularly happens both at the city and then regularly happens with law firms to do conflicts checks and other things to ensure that we do not have any conflicts of interest that should be disclosed. So I am going to, this is a receive and file report, so I'll move to receive and file. Discussion. Seeing none, all in approval, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? And that item is dealt with. Next, we have an item that is referred by our Community Development and Regulatory Services Committee, and this is relating to special laws and approval of liquor licenses for the American Swedish Institute and Minneapolis Institute of Arts. And it appears Ms. Bergman will give the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee. My name is Sasha Bergman with the IGR department. Before you is a resolution to approve the special law passed by the legislature to allow the city to authorize on-sale liquor licenses to two cultural entities in the city. However, I'm hoping to just provide a brief background on what special law is and why it's coming before the committee for approval, if that's okay. So a special law is defined by the Constitution as a law that's passed by the legislature that applies to a single local unit of government or a group of local units of government in a single county or contiguous counties. They must be named as to which specific local government they are. And the Constitution directs that special laws must be approved by the affected unit of government in order for them to go into effect. And the process there is outlined in statute, which says that special laws are voted on by the governing board of the local government unit, and then the city clerk or the equivalent in other local units of government must file a certificate with the Secretary of State's office to verify its passage. And if this does not occur before the beginning of the next legislative session, the next regular legislative session, then the special law is deemed not approved and would need to go through the whole process up at the legislature again. There are three exceptions to the need for local approval of a special law that's passed, and I'll briefly explain those. The first is if the local government unit is exercising or authorized to exercise an authority that's not currently in general law. The second is if the local government has a population of more than 1 million. And the third is if the local government is brought within the general law in a number of different scenarios. And so this year, the legislature passed 3 special laws that pertain to the city of Minneapolis. 2 of them do require local approval, but 1 does not. I'll briefly mention that one. The legislature authorized counties, licensing jurisdictions in Hennepin County to to authorize bars to stay open until 4 a.m. on the night of the All-Star Game if they choose to do so. And that does not require local approval because Hennepin County has more than 1 million people, and also because it's granting local governments to an authority that isn't currently authorized under general law, which is to stay open until 4 a.m. The two special laws that do require local approval before next session include one related to the automated property system, which is not before the committee today, and it will be at a later date likely. And then the second is the resolution before you, which comes to you from Community Development and Reg Services. It was placed on the consent calendar and approved earlier this week. From here, it will go to the full council for approval. And it basically is a special law that allows the city to issue liquor licenses to the American Swedish Institute or its concessionaires, or to the Minneapolis Institute of Arts, or entities holding catering contracts on their premises. My understanding from the testimony at the legislature is that this was just to bring those two in line with other similarly situated cultural amenities in the city, and it didn't seem to draw any controversy. So with that, I'm happy to stand for questions.
All right, thank you very much, Ms. Bergman. I'm not seeing any questions, but I really do appreciate the overview on special laws so that we can understand that process. And I will go ahead and move approval pursuant to the authority before us to authorize local approval for the liquor licenses as articulated. Discussion, seeing none, on approval, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? And that item is approved. And finally, we are to our more major report for today, which is a comprehensive overview of the activities and actions that happened during the 2014 legislative session. And Ms. Lesh, looks like you are going to lead off the presentation today, so thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and it felt like it was a 30-year session, so it might be 2040 right now.
Just slipped out, but
for all
yeah.
I know, it easily could be 2040.
Okay.
Right now, so. So thank you, Madam Chair and committee members. Again, my name is Melissa Lesh, Senior Government Relations Representative for the city. I'm here with my colleagues, Director of IGR, Jean Ranieri, our unfortunately former intern, Nicholas Leingang, who has fortunately, however, taken on a new leadership position in Congressman Ellison's office. So while we were sad to lose him, we are very happy with where he is headed. We have, as you just heard from Ms. Bergman, Sasha Bergman with IGR Department, and Lauren Olson also. So we are all here and ready to answer any questions you may have. So what we're going to be walking through right now is an overview and a recap of the 2014 legislative session, and the pieces we're going to be walking through are just a really quick recap of the early progress that we made in session. We did give you kind of an interim update, so we'll briefly touch on some of the issues we've discussed before. We'll talk about capital investment, taxes, the budget, and other policy items, and then we'll conclude with items that did not pass. Just a very brief summary. As the committee knows, this being an odd-numbered year, this is the second year of the biennium. 2013 being the first year of the biennium was the year that the legislature took time to address the state's budget. So that's the time where you're going to see a lot more work being done on larger dollar amounts, larger funding programs, and more work done on the policy language that impacts those programs. This being the even year of the biennium, the primary focus and where we spent a lot of our time was on capital investment, or the bonding bill, of which we ended up with 2 of them this year, unusually. So what you'll be seeing as we move through the presentation when we look at the budget, because there was a supplemental budget that was passed, this not being a budget year, there just needed to be some tweaking done with a supplemental budget. Since we came into session with a surplus, there was minimal work done to address what the extra money was that was at the state's disposal. So just a brief recap as to where we left you when last we saw you. We were happy to report that the legislature and the governor did sign the minimum wage bill probably about halfway through session. So that will progress over the course of the next couple of years. We'll be looking at $8 minimum wage this coming August 1st of 2014. That will be followed with a $1 increase to $9 per hour on August 1st of 15, and then that remaining 50-cent increase will go into effect of August 1st of 2016, bringing us to the $9.50 wage August 1st of 2016. We also did work early on with the state and other local units of government regulating farmers markets that primarily dealt with sampling of products at farmers markets and cooking demonstrations at farmers markets. The item in there that was the most important to the city was some added flexibility and added local control over the permitting and the regulating of the number of days that vendors could be open and things of that nature. And then finally, we early on in session passed what we call Tax Bill 1. Tax Bill 2 ended up closing out the session, but Tax Bill 1 passed early on, and the bulk of the first tax bill dealt with issues of federal conformity and a repeal of a lot of the business-to-business taxes that were passed in the 2013 session. You may have noticed a small adjustment on some of your income taxes after you filed. You might have seen additional money here and there show up in your bank account unexpectedly, or maybe they took more from you unexpectedly, but that was because of the delayed impact of Tax Bill 1 going into effect and matching that with federal conformity. So with that, I'll move on to our discussion of the capital investment or the bonding bill. We went into this session after the money was paid back to the schools that was owed to them in the school shift. We came into session with just over a $600 million surplus. And so a lot of the discussion over the course of the session was, what do you do with that extra surplus? Does it go into additional funding for programs, the cash flow account, the budget reserve, or potentially cash for bonding bills? The legislature did elect to use about $200 million in cash for one-time projects. These were projects that could be completed with that one-time appropriation. So what we ended up with was two bonding bills, which is unusual. We have $846 million in the traditional general obligation bonding bill and about $200 million in a general fund, or what everyone just refers to as the cash bill, for a total of just over $1.2 billion in infrastructure investments. Just some highlights for the city's perspective on the bonding bill. Of course, we are most happy about the $21.5 million we were able to secure for the redevelopment of Nicollet Mall. I want to take a moment to very much thank our partners at the Minneapolis Downtown Council. Their work was tireless. They spent many hours, the leadership from the council, some of our business partners, their lobbyists. We really could not have done this without their help. I also want to thank Council President, Council Vice President, the Mayor, and all of our other council members who came to the Capitol and lobbied tirelessly for a whole host of issues, including Nicollet Mall. So we really thank you all for your efforts. We could not have done it without your tireless support. A few other big highlights we're really excited about: the full funding of the request, $8.5 million for the sculpture garden. A lot of water in the sculpture garden that needs to be dealt with. In the cash bill and the bonding bill both had money for local bridge replacement and local road replacement. So you'll see that listed actually 4 times, because there's 2 pots in the cash bill and 2 pots in the bonding bill. In the bonding bill, $12.25 million was designated for local bridge replacement, and of that, almost the entirety of it was for the Franklin Avenue Bridge repairs. That was a county request that we've supported for many years, so we're happy to see that moving forward. We also had $24.35 million for local bridges, just over $500,000 for Hennepin Center for the Arts, and $330,000 for the Brian Coyle Center. Also some money for the University of Minnesota, and MCTC had some structural needs as well. This was a tremendously successful year for public housing. The advocacy community was completely and totally united, and the city was a signer on to that coalition as well, the Homes for All Coalition. And they went in with a request of $100 million, and because they were unified and had a consistent, coherent message, they were successful in obtaining the full $100 million. So what you see reflected on this list is the $20 million that was in the capital investment the general obligation bonding bill for the 20, and then the remaining was in the cash bill for the 80 million. So they're just in 2 separate places, but the full 100 million is there. So the final list for the capital investment bill, $15 million to the Met Council's Transit Capital Improvement Program, of which the 35W and Lake Street Station is a named eligible project. As well as other transit corridors, and for the city, including the Penn Avenue North BRT and the Botno, LRT planning. And then the cash bill for capital investment, again, just a few really big chunks in that $200 million. We have from the city's perspective, our important issues are the $1 million for the Safe Routes to Schools infrastructure. $3 million will be going to the YWCA on Nicollet Mall in downtown Minneapolis for their early learning center. They really are a regional hub. It's located in downtown Minneapolis, but it attracts young families and young children from all over the region. So that's why you see that recognized as a statewide priority. And again, you see these two other pots for local road and local bridge replacement, and we have the totals listed there as well. And then finally, that $80 million that will go to Minnesota Housing for the Housing Infrastructure Bond Program. So with that, I'll pause for any questions on bonding.
Council President Johnson.
Madam Chair, Ms. Lish, I wrote two things down. What is the Tate Lab at the U?
Scroll back here. Yeah, the Tate Lab at the U was actually the University of Minnesota's top priority project, and it is a new physics laboratory at the U. It's a really exciting project, and it's going to be an entirely new building. So we can send you some really specific information and I think there's actually some renderings available that we could get to you.
Okay, great. Now, on your last item on that page also, you say $20 million to Minnesota Housing for public housing rehabilitation, so that would be something that our Public Housing Authority would be eligible for? Is that different than is there allocation within that housing bill that's for public housing in particular?
Madam Chair and Council President, yes, this is a program that is a competitive program that our CPED and our Public Housing Authority would then be able to make application to.
Okay, thank you.
Which is a large part of the reason why we were so supportive of that, because it will have a significant impact on residents in the city. Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. And with that, I will turn the mic over to Ms. Bergman, who will walk through the tax bill.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, Madam Chair, members. Sasha Bergman from IGR. As Ms. Lesh mentioned, there was a tax bill early on in session that was passed and then just left kind of some other provisions, some policy items, and a little bit of extra money to work with in the tax committee later on in session. So the governor recently signed into law the Omnibus Tax Bill 2, which spent $103 million in additional expenditures. Some of note that you might want to know about include an increase in the LGA appropriation, or the base amount, by $7.8 million, which is for 2015, the 2016 base, and then ongoing. And what that means for Minneapolis, according to a run done by nonpartisan House Research, is that Minneapolis will get an additional $986,000 in 2015. The tax bill also included sales tax or local government sales tax clarifications. In the previous legislative session, the legislature granted cities and counties to have a sales tax exemption on purchases that they make, but it sort of inadvertently left out instrumentalities of local governments and special taxing districts and other groups. And so this costed a little bit of money, but it did bring it in line, or it will by the beginning of 2017. It was a little delay in the implementation. And then finally, the legislature enacted a one-time increase in direct property tax relief, 6% increase for renters, and a 3% increase for homeowners, and that's in the current biennium. Some of the policy-related city-related policy changes that were in the second tax bill include an extension of the city and county deadline for proposed levies to be certified. And so instead of September 15th, there's a little bit of extra time, and that's delayed now until September 30th. And then finally, a little bit of additional flexibility for certain development tax increment financing districts. And as I understand it, this will not impact any of the TIF districts in Minneapolis. Moving on to the budget bill that was passed, the supplemental appropriations bill. And again, this is sort of a big omnibus bill that had spending in a number of different areas in the state government. Overall, the general fund impact for the current biennium was $262 million in new spending. And then in the out years, it was $851.8 million for fiscal 16 and 17. One of the biggest spending items in that bill was in the Health and Human Services budget area, which was an $80 million item, 5% rate increase for home and community-based workers in the healthcare industry. And then also of note for the city was $300,000 per year healthy homes appropriation, where $60,000 is for lead poisoning prevention activities, and then $240,000 is for healthy homes grants that can mitigate housing-based health threats, which is something that the city could be eligible for to receive. And then finally, a $1.5 million increase for Safe Harbor to combat child sex trafficking for the current biennium, and then a $1 million increase for the Homeless Youth Act. And with that, I will turn it over to Mr. Ranieri unless there are any questions.
We have another question from Council President Johnson.
Ms. Bergman, now our little bonus of local government aid, though, will have to be shared with the Park Board. Am I correct? Is that our share, or is that the total?
That is the total. Yeah, that is the total share so that will have to be shared with the Park Board. Yes.
Board. Okay.
Yep.
All right. Thanks.
Yep.
Madam Chair and members, I want to talk to this supplemental appropriation, talk about recycling and environment. The recycling, as you're aware, back in February, we approved support for the additional funding for the SCORE funding. We were hoping to maybe double that or equal the $14 million that's put out every year. We wound up with a $4 million increase for this year, a $3 million increase of the base for the next 2 years. So the $14 million appropriation that we have now will be 18 starting now, and 15, and then in 16 and 17, it'll be $17 million. Of that, another couple other things occurred that are a policy. One is that in the metro area only, we tried to do it statewide, but we lost on a floor amendment, that commercial buildings will now have to recycle. They would have to offer at least recycling opportunities for at least 3 different types of materials. Either it could be paper, glass, or metals, and that is going to go into effect, I think, next year, but it's only in the metro area. Also, half of the new funding that's going to be given to counties and passed through the cities needs to be used for compostable materials and for recycling. So that's what happened in the whole area of recycling and SCORE. That was put into the omnibus bill. It was not a separate bill as introduced. For pollinators, there's a bill dealing with labeling. You will starting this year, starting in July 15. If you're wishing to buy any plants or nursery materials or bedding plants, if they're going to advertise their pollinator free, they need to say that they're free from certain kinds of pesticides. And if the nursery owner or the store doesn't know, they shouldn't say that it's pollinator friendly. And then also with bee kills, there's legislation now that allows for compensation to people who own their beehives. They need to go through a process to justify and to substantiate the claim. It will be checked by the Department of Agriculture. If it meets the criteria, it would be funded. If they found that maybe the person who they identified who improperly applied the pesticide, that person would be held liable and have to pay restitution. There's also in that bill is a whole study to come back and say, should the State Department of Agriculture establish an apiary program going back to like registration, working more with beekeepers and such. That was added during conference committee. And also that was part of the bill also is that the Commissioner of Agriculture, in consultation with the University of Minnesota, the Minnesota Zoo, and others, can form panels to investigate why bee kills are occurring in our state. So that's what happened in the whole issue of pollinators. Water issues, an awful lot happened in 2013. This year is part of the Clean Water Fund. $800,000 was appropriated to the Met Council for additional studies for water issues around White Bear Lake and the North and East Metro region.
I had a question on the commercial recycling. How does that actually work with who is then responsible for the enforcement of that? I just was, I knew this was happening, and it is really exciting, actually. It's a big change statewide. I haven't heard many details of how this will be implemented.
Madam Chair, it's a good question. We'll need to work with the county because they are responsible for the implementation of the act. I know ourselves and other cities have passed some ordinances, and the whole issue is enforcement. So we will need to work with the county on that issue.
So potentially the county may need to pay us to assist with enforcement?
Madam Chair, that's a possibility, yeah.
Okay.
It's
thank
something
you.
we can bring up with them, yes.
Okay. I'm just interested. Thank you.
In the transportation investments, unfortunately, we knew there wasn't going to be a massive new transportation funding bill this session. However, the legislature did, as Ms. Lesh talked about and Ms. Bergman talked about, the bonding bill and the general fund cash bill, as well as the supplemental budget bill, included money for transportation issues. The bonding bill was gone over, or you see before, not to go over it again. Same with the capital investment cash bill. And then in the supplemental budget, there's some money to the Metro Council. It's $500,000 for new shelters and improvements to existing shelters. It doesn't say where, it just says $500,000 to the Met Council for the system. Also, for this year, statewide, but in the metro area, $144,000 was appropriated to the Met Council for Election Day free rides to the polls. So on Election Day, there will be free rides on Metro Transit. And also on transit in Greater Minnesota. And that was Representative Dane's idea from Minneapolis. He brought it forward and it caught on. Suburban transit providers have $250,000 possibly for some equipment. The I-35W Lake Street Station has $1 million for design and engineering, and also the Snelling BRT. Things that did not prevail, the pothole money fell by the wayside. Transit Development Improvements, TED, that was not funded. And then Transportation Economic Development was also not funded. Education investments, Nicholas.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair, members of the committee. As I said, my name is Nicholas Langang, former intern with the IGR office. There were some new and good investments in early learning and early childhood family education. The state in fiscal year 15 puts $4.65 million additionally into early childhood scholarships. And they also removed the $5,000 per year cap that existed, that previously existed, which was also one of the goals of the Women's Economic Security Act. They also increased funding for early childhood family education by $4.65 million in fiscal year 15, and then just over $5 million and then just over $5 million starting in fiscal year 16 added to the base. And there also was new language for early childhood family education programs, which directs programs to create a community needs assessment, and that will highlight underserved populations and direct funds to most at-risk families. The Northside Achievement Zone is also slated to receive $350,000 in fiscal year 15, and then moving forward, NAS will get $200,000 per year. And as it says on the slide, the funding may be used for programming and services that are consistent with federal promise neighborhood agreements and requirements. Thank you. And next up is Ms. Lesh.
Council members, we're now going to move on to a whole host of other policy issues. Despite this being a bonding year, there still was a lot of substantial work done on specific policy items. So the first item I wanted to bring up today is the issue of expungements. And I want to give a shout out to our wonderful Senator Bobby Joe Champion, who really was a leader on this issue and has been for the last several years, and worked very hard to pass this legislation that will have a terrific impact on a lot of young people and adults who have been limited in some of their options because of previous records. So prior to the expungement bill this year, the court had the ability, when it came to a juvenile record, to expunge the actual adjudication, but they could not go back and expunge everything else that went along with that, the complete and total record. Just the actual result of that process, that final adjudication, could be expunged. So now, because of a court action actually that called this question and this bill being passed this year, the court will now have the authority to expunge that entire juvenile record. Another significant piece of this legislation was the allowing of the expunging of records that are housed in the executive branch of the government. And this did actually bring up some really interesting conversations about balance of power and the three branches and things of that nature. That does the judicial branch have the right and the ability to expunge records that are housed in the executive branch? And so the legislation clarified that when it comes to records where the executive branch may be maintaining records that are preventing someone from being able to, say, apply for a job that would require executive branch licensure, like a nursing license and credentialing and things of that nature. And if those records then are housed in the executive branch, a judge may order those records also be expunged. It's not an automatic. It does need to be a request, but that is now an option as well. Lots of people were successfully having their records expunged in the judicial branch, but still having records housed at the BCA, at the Department of Public Safety, things of that nature that were housed in that executive branch, so they were still on record. So in an employment search, a search for eligibility for an apartment, those other records were still showing up. So this will allow for that expanded expungement authority. And finally, the legislation added 3 new categories that an individual could request expungement, and you see them listed here. They're in order of kind of the severity and under what circumstances and in what type of offenses and under what length of time someone has the authority, the ability to request those expungements. We know this will continue to be an issue going forward. There will be bumps along the way and unforeseen data issues, so we expect that the issue will continue to need to be worked on over the years. Really tremendous work was done this year in the area of domestic violence and some issues that the city has long supported and championed. Happily, I can report did pass this year. One, having to do with firearms and orders for protection. The bar for removing a firearm from someone who was under an order for protection, the abuser, the bar was actually quite high, that the offender there had to be an imminent risk in the situation, there had to have been threats with the firearm made and things of that nature. Now with this new legislation that was passed this year, whenever there is a firearm, whenever there is an order for protection, the judge always, no matter what the circumstances are, will have the authority to require that weapon be surrendered. Crime of violence. In statute, there is a long list of things that the state has designated to be crimes of violence, and they tend to be fairly significant crimes. Homicide, first-degree assault, things of that nature that are fairly significant. And one thing that was added this year was fifth-degree assault. And this is something that our police department and city attorney's office has long wanted and supported. Fifth-degree assault, especially in domestic abuse situations, tends to be domestic assault by strangulation. And domestic assault by strangulation tends to be, what we know from our departments, a significant indicator for the escalation of that situation, that we're now moving into the area of a domestic homicide, firearms, things of that nature. It's a really major indicator, and it's present as a major indicator in a lot of domestic abuse homicides, that was a preceding factor. So crime of violence was added, fifth degree assault was added to the list of crimes of violence that would prevent that offender from owning a firearm. And then finally, probable cause arrests. This is also something that will give added flexibility to the police department when they're attempting to make an arrest in a warrantless domestic abuse situation. These are the situations where the victim sometimes might not want to make the report, might be afraid to make the report, might retract that, and also situations where the offender knows that we have 24 hours to make that warrantless arrest. If the victim withdraws their complaint, we have 24 hours to make that warrantless arrest, and they know to just stay out of the house for 24 hours. It's pretty simple. So what the legislature accomplished this year was extending that time window to 72 hours. That will accommodate weekends, shift changes, and time to work with a victim to support an actual warranted charge then. Oh, scrap metal, my favorite topic. Scrap metal regulation. As you may remember from 2013, we worked very closely with the Ramsey County Attorney's Office to look at ways that we could be bolstering the reporting and regulation of scrap metal and recycling in Minnesota, particularly over in Ramsey County. Over the last year, the year preceding 2013, we're seeing cars just being stolen off the street by tow trucks, taken and scrapped before the owner even woke up in the morning, and the car is already crushed. So what we passed last year were a lot of regulations around having to show proof of ownership, title, recording of VIN numbers, things of that nature that you would have thought would have already been in place but needed to be enacted last year. This year we worked on part 2. What was required in last year's legislation also was the Minneapolis Police Department was to convene a work group of stakeholders from the recycling industry, law enforcement, victims of scrap metal theft, to develop a new software system based on the city's already existing APS system, our existing automated property system, to look at how we can expand that system to not just cover pawn and secondhand goods as it does now, but to also allow for the reporting of scrap metal. So we worked with the stakeholder group throughout the summer and fall, and we've found that the computer system is actually going to be a lot more complicated to build than was initially anticipated, and we want to make sure that we do it right. We have really some terrific small businesses in Minneapolis and throughout the state of Minnesota who are in the scrap and recycling industry and who really are trying to do the right thing, and we want to make sure that we are building a system that works for their business models and doesn't add a layer of reporting and another layer of software onto what they want to do. So what we'd like to build is something that integrates to their existing point-of-sale systems. So what the legislation this year did was give the city the authority to enact a 72-cent per transaction fee. When the system is eventually built, that will come back for another council action, and it delays the timeline for implementation for another year so we can really have time to build that system properly. So more to come. And then data. What we have really seen in the last, I'd say, 3 years is the dominating presence of the topic of data and what is affectionately called now big data. There really isn't a topic that anyone at the Capitol works on anymore that the angle of data doesn't have to come up, whether it's education, health and human services, you name it, there's a data component to that bill. And so to address that, the second point you see listed here is the legislature, I think very wisely this year, created a Legislative Commission on Data Practices and Personal Data Privacy. Currently, what happens is if a bill has data components to it or data implications, it gets channeled to, in the House, the Civil Law Committee, or in the Senate, the Judiciary Committee. And you can imagine the number of bills that could end up there simply for their data practices related purposes, and that's not the area of expertise of these committees, at least it shouldn't be. So the legislature has created this new commission that will look at how should we be addressing data issues. Do we need a whole new committee? Should things be going to this commission, things of that nature? So we'll be watching and attending that commission as they're formed. Important to the city is the unauthorized access to private data Act. We worked very closely with the League of Minnesota Cities on this bill. As you recall, I think it was 2 summers ago, the story broke of all of these unauthorized data breaches, particularly at the State Department of Public Safety, having to do with people's driver's licenses. And the legislature wanted to take action, recognizing that in the course of doing their jobs, that public employees, state and local public employees, need to access this data. But how do you regulate that access, and how do you handle the breach and inappropriate use of that access? So legislation was passed this year addressing that issue and giving some rules of the road for how cities need to handle both accessing that data and potential breaches. And finally, I think this is hopefully the last you'll hear from me. I'm talking for a long time, so I apologize, but also very excited to report this was a huge, huge win this session, the Women's Economic Security Act. This legislation did pass with significant bipartisan support, and it was a very long road. The package of legislation that the city did support from its onset initially began with 11 pieces of legislation, and what ended up passing were 9 separate bills, but then passed all together in one omnibus package of the Women's Economic Security Act. Included in here is also the, I think Nicholas mentioned earlier, the removal of the $5,000 cap for early learning scholarships, and minimum wage was also passed again as kind of part of this package. But the other pieces in here are pieces that we'll be working with the Human Resources Department here at the city, be presenting to them and walking through this with them. But they really are things that the city already has been doing, and we actually helped, especially with the pay equity piece, work on this bill. I'd like to thank Council President Johnson for coming up and testifying on pay equity, and that we were able to say that we, as a large employer, have successfully been able to comply with pay equity. So if we can, so can others. There are differences between public and private employers that were real and needed to be negotiated, and we think that this legislation represents a good compromise between wanting to move the ball forward, but then also recognizing the realities of private business is a little bit different than public employers. So you see we have the pay equity certificate of compliance for 40 or more employees, and that is for if a company has a $500,000 contract with the state or more. We have a grant program for women training, so to places like Women Venture and things of that nature for training and education for high wage, high demand jobs. That will be channeled through DEED. There's an attempt to create a retirement savings plan specifically for women in Minnesota, recognizing that women leave the workforce often for long periods of time to take care of their families, and because of that, they lose time accruing financial long-term investment in their pensions, in their retirement funds, and things of that nature. So this would be creating, this doesn't create it, this creates the plan to create it, creating a potential program that could be a retirement plan that women who are maybe out of the workforce could then be saving for retirement. We have expanded parental leave, and we worked with the Council Vice President a bit on this earlier, looking at breastfeeding women and mothers, that there wasn't a lot of teeth to that law, that there was a requirement for businesses to have places to allow breastfeeding, but there really wasn't there were no consequences or repercussions for not having that. So this added some enforcement to that. The parental leave also expanded parental leave from 6 weeks of unpaid leave to 12 weeks of unpaid leave. That was a huge expansion. Expanded sick leave to include grandchildren, and also very interesting, expanded sick leave to include victims of domestic abuse, sexual assault, and stalking. So victims of those crimes that they need time off to deal with those, the implications of those events, that they have time as well for sick leave. Wage disclosure protections, and then the removal of the child care cap. So any questions on the Women's Economic Security Act?
No, I'll just note this is a kind of a nice package of items that are here, and I think a whole collection of why these things were on the list. Some of them, like I'll just mention the Minnesota Parental Leave Act. Just my guess there is that Minnesota is actually one of the first states in the country to pass a parental leave act. This was something that was on the books long before the Family Medical Leave Act. And so, I just think this was a move to get more parity with now the national trend, whereas actually when it was first passed, Minnesota was a national leader in passing this kind of leave law at all. So.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
We also have a question from Councilmember Quincy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just had a follow-up question on the Women's Economic Security Act. You mentioned that there were 11 or 9. Anyway, there were 2 that were not included. Are they going to be brought up in a subsequent session? They're not part of this Omnibus Act, but what were they?
One was the paid sick days, which has been a perennial issue. The irony that the very people who are touching your food and taking care of your children are the very people who don't have paid sick days is kind of astounding. So that was one that will most definitely be coming back. And I'd have to look at I don't know, does anyone remember what with there being a duplication of the minimum wage and the cap, I'd have to double check. Let me see if there even was another one, but paid sick days is the big one, definitely, that fell off the list.
Well, it was a huge effort, so I'm glad we were able to get so many of those things done. I was just curious if there'd be some form of things that were missing that we'd like to get back in, but thank you for that.
Most definitely. Thank you. And with that, I can also talk about the liquor bill, unless you might be sick of hearing my voice, so maybe Mr. Ranieri might want to talk about the liquor bill.
Madam Chair, the first item is the new conditions for licensure revocation. That was a big issue for our city. We thank you for helping with that, and also Mr. Wilson. That was put into the bill this year. Also, the small brewer growler sales. You're allowed to have growler sales on Sundays, but you can only have brewer sales on, small brewer growler sales. The proposal was to have them on Sundays, and that did not pass. That was basically off sale. Some people thought that was sort of the gateway to other things for next year, so that did not pass. However, you can have the small brewers can be open on Sunday, their tap rooms can be open on Sunday to sell on sale, but it needs authorization of the governing body. Micro distilleries now have the ability to have, just like small brewers with tap rooms, they can have cocktail rooms, and they have to be licensed by the city, but they cannot sell off sale, but they can sell on sale. We talked about the special provisions for Minneapolis Institute of Arts and the American Swedish Institute, and I think we also covered the All-Star game. So, Madam Chair, I'll stop for any questions. Cell phones. Ms. Lesh talked about her favorite bill being the copper theft or the metals bill. That was really a model for one of the efforts this year on cell phones. Senator Dietzig authored a bill that basically said that let's try and find, listening to police officers and police chiefs around the region, one way to really try and curb cell phones is to take away their value. So what this bill did, Article 2 of the bill, which now is in law, basically models the copper theft bill, and says basically if you're going to want to sell a cell phone, resell it to someone at a retail store, you need to, number one, give all sorts of information, your name, address, things of that nature. You cannot get cash. You can get a check or you can get a store credit. And that's going to go in this year, and it's going to be statewide. The other part of that legislation was the so-called kill switch provision, and it's not really a kill switch. The industry said they can have some sort of functionalities on their phones for sale in Minnesota after July 1 of next year that could remotely make a phone not function if it has been stolen. So the industry is volunteering to do that, so the legislature put down a date of July 1. So that's what happened at cell phones, and I know Councilmember Frey and Council President Johnson came and testified, and so did some of our police department, and it was a great effort again. That was a coalition of the police departments, the sheriffs, all involved in this issue. Pensions, not much happened. There is an increase going into effect starting July 1, 2015. This is a mistake, and I apologize for that. It'll be a 25.25 or 0.25% increase for people who belong to the general program for public employee pensions. As you're aware, the police departments and fire departments are having a pension change and an increase in their contributions this year, starting in a couple weeks. And I will turn it over to Ms. Bergman.
We have a question from Council President Johnson.
Mr. Ranieri, I think Ms. Becker at Board of Adjustment asked for the calculation on that for us payroll, and I think it comes into, it's going to blow our whole increase in local government plus some. Yeah, so yeah. It's going to be it's not cheap. It's over $1 million for us.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, just a couple more items. The legislature passed an Health and Human Services policy bill. It was rather large with lots of different provisions, but as it relates to the city, it did contain an update to the local public health statute that I know our health department had worked on with other local public health advocates and had supported this item. And then also, although the city had taken a supportive position of including e-cigarettes in the Minnesota Clean Indoor Air Act, along with the League of Cities and others, it unfortunately did not prevail this session. Evidently, there weren't the votes to pass that. However, the legislature did include a ban of e-cigarette use in basically government buildings owned by the state, cities, counties, townships, school districts, and other political subdivisions. Also banned the use of e-cigarettes in MnSCU and U of M buildings and facilities, healthcare and daycare facilities, public schools, and also retains the ability for local governments to enact stricter regulations if they choose to do so. And then finally, near the end of the legislative session, a compromise was reached on medical cannabis or medical marijuana. After many weeks, committee hearings, amendments, and iterations of this bill, all advocates and the governor and the authors of the bill kind of came to a compromised agreement, which does not allow smoking of medical cannabis, but does allow folks to use cannabis in pill, liquid, or vapor form. And also, in the committee documents for today in our larger wrap-up, there's a more comprehensive list of all of the qualifying conditions that are included, but some of them include glaucoma, cancer-related symptoms, HIV, AIDS, seizures, and others. And then it provides for 2 in-state manufacturing facilities and a total of 8 distribution facilities, which the application process will begin for the manufacturers this August, and distribution centers can open as early as July of 2015. I believe there's some ability for the commissioner to delay the implementation a little bit for particular reasons, but otherwise we can expect in about a year that those will be open. Finally, just to make mention of some of the bills that did not pass this legislative session. Although a lot was accomplished, there's still more work to do. The driver's license bill did not ultimately pass this year. On the final day of session, it did pass out of the House Ways and Means Committee, which was the last stop before the floor, but there wasn't enough time, and evidently the House leadership has agreed bipartisanly to take this up next year. Also, the automatic license plate reader bill, municipal preemption of state pesticide rules, and payday lending regulations were all bills that did not make it through the entire process. And finally, 3 provisions that were in the tax conference committee at first in either the House or the Senate bill did not prevail and did not become law, including the repeal of the Minneapolis Library Debt Service Aid, the exclusion of the first $150,000 in value from commercial industrial properties from the state general levy, which would have resulted in an overall shift from lower valued properties to higher valued CI. And then finally, the inclusion of mixed use properties in special service district assessments was not adopted in the conference committee. And with that concludes our presentation, and we'd all be happy to stand for any questions that you have.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Council President Johnson has a comment.
So, Ms. Bergman, so what you're saying is that there was an attempt to take our library debt service aid away, but it did not prevail.
Yes, actually, it wasn't included in either the House or the Senate bills as they moved to the floor, but on the House floor, an amendment was adopted that used that money for a number of other things.
And that was defeated?
It passed in the House bill on the floor, but then in conference committee, when the House and Senate rectified all their differences, it wasn't adopted.
I see. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
And I might just get a reminder on how many years out that might be an issue.
Madam Chair, I think I want to say 9 or 10 years.
Okay.
It goes out a ways.
Okay. Well, it's just important for us to remember because of how it's positioned.
Yeah. We will need to be vigilant for the next 9 or 10 years on that.
I think also understanding what was the history on why this relief was granted in the first place, as we know that legislators change and go, and all these things do happen in the normal cycles of things. So thank you.
So, Madam Chair, also, we have about 9 or 10 years, and our friends over in St. Paul have about 25, because they have a $2.7 million appropriation for about the next 25 years.
Good to remember. So I don't know, maybe there are some questions, but I guess I will just say this, wow, this is bonding year. And what a tremendous report. I think, too, there are often a lot of years where the majority of our work is sort of, I don't know what you want to call it, playing defense or kind of making sure our interests as a city are protected. And clearly this was a year where we were, I think, able to make just a lot of positive changes impacting our infrastructure, impacting our environment, impacting the interests of the city as an enterprise, as well as our residents, who lots of different groups were involved in advocating on a whole variety of issues. Also, you know, as happens when you have some legislators in the majority, our Minneapolis delegation clearly worked extremely hard. We're very proactive, carried a lot of bills, and you know, just really deserves a lot of thanks. Some of the most difficult items are the items on, you know, this in the bonding bill, which requires a lot of complicated negotiation. So again, you know, special thanks to Ms. Lesh, but really to the entire team, because I know everyone played a role in working with our stakeholder groups, working with the city, working with the downtown council, working with others on our number one priority, which was the Nicollet Mall. And so other city staff as well, clearly from Public Works and other areas, really a lot of folks stepping up to the plate. So many thanks to go around. And again, I think I've said this in an email, but my thanks to all of the committee. I think every single person on this committee had an opportunity to go to the legislature to interact with our delegation members as well as with other legislators, to have an opportunity to testify on a particular city-supported issue. And all of your efforts are really appreciated. And thanks as well that they were done in good coordination with our IGR staff. So really appreciate that, and I think everyone got some good opportunities to be engaged this year in what was really, I think, a very productive and successful year for the city of Minneapolis. So thank you very much, and I will go ahead and move to receive and file this report. Discussion, all in approval, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? And that item is approved, and I think with that we are done with our agenda for the day, so we are adjourned. Thank you.